today at the community. Business Central is a very exciting space. A lot of very nice functionality that's being rolled out by Microsoft, both on the platform technology architecture and also functionally, right? A lot of really good new features coming out constantly with the new waves that are being released a few times during the year. So really excited to be part of the community and be here presenting to you. So today, again, let me introduce myself. My name is Nirav Shah. I've been in the Microsoft kind of Dynamics NAV channel since 2012. I started my career implementing NAV 2009 SP1 and basically been working with every version since. Basically, I'm all on the consulting side, implementing jobs, manufacturing, warehousing, inventory control for all different industries in between. So excited to be presenting my topic today, which is warehousing options in Business Central. So there's many different ways to set up your warehouse in Business Central, effectively your location, and that determines how inventory will be moving between different documents and different records. So that could be sales orders, purchase orders, picks, different allocations that you would do, and to support some of those processes, how you would set up your location card in Business Central. And what I'm going to be talking about today applies to most versions. If there's a specific version that's in question, obviously we could talk about it towards the end of my presentation. But this applies to most versions, especially the latest version. What's a typical warehousing flow in Business Central, right? That's the first question I get. How does, what does what does that look like? So you have inbound orders, and this is a chart that came directly off of Microsoft Documents. So I'll just quickly run through this here. The first thing you have is inbound orders, right? So that could be purchase orders, other type of purchasing facing documents where suppliers, in essence, are sending inventory, right? You're receiving inventory into your warehouse. Now, what happens is when inventory is received into the warehouse, that's usually the very first place that inventory control needs to be thought out, and that is where inventory is going to be stored. Most people have a receiving dock, right? And this presentation, again, let me just back up, will apply to manufacturing and distribution companies. So the receiving dock, right, inventory will come in, it gets placed. Now, what happens at that point? A few different paths, actually. You could then go ahead and cross dock it that we see here directly to shipping if we wanted to, and that's a option on the location card. Or we receive it in, we break that inventory down, and then we introduce another document called a putaway, or we take that inventory that comes in from receiving and it goes straight into a stocking location, right? Or goes straight into inventory per se. But that's the very first point that creates financial activity, and that creates inventory in the system that increases inventory for that item, and then gets put away in a location or directly to a location bin or through a put away document, and then ultimately to a location bin, which could be the default location bin, or it could be cross-docked directly to shipping, so it gets processed and turned around on the sales order. Okay, so that's usually the very first point. Now, an inventory comes in and it goes into your inventory location, or it could go into location and bin, right? Or it could be inventory, location, bin, and zones, right? Zones is another concept that we'll talk about here in a little bit as well. So that allows you to look at, depending on how big your warehouse, think about warehouse, maybe somebody like Amazon, right? They have zones within the warehouse, and within the zones, they have bins itself. So there's some logic or some rules that they apply from a zone perspective on when inventory goes in, when inventory goes out of there. And that's typically more of what I like to call an expert warehousing flow that we'll look a little bit later when we introduce zones. Now, inventory is sitting on the stocking shelf until some point it needs to be picked, right? Either for production or for assembly. Inventory needs to be picked, or it's going to go into shipping, right? The picking is an optional step in Business Central. you do not need to implement a formal pick process in Business Central. You could just say, I'm going to consume inventory directly from the location and go and consume it directly into the supply order, which in our case here is assembly order or production order. You do not need a picking document. So that's the basic warehousing flow effectively. Now, when inventory gets consumed, it's left, right, decremented out of inventory. So that creates item ledger entries that represent a consumption directly to the supply document. Like I said, in this case would be a assembly order or production order. Another way you could take that inventory, consume it, is through a inventory pick. Okay, that is a more formal process. The inventory pick is a document that actually allocates inventory from a location bin, so that takes away from available or on-hand inventory through the system. And generally also you also see that type of allocation through the bin content table. The third way you could take inventory out of the system is what's called a warehousing pick. Okay, the warehousing pick is a little bit more of a sophisticated pick than an inventory pick, and whereas you could take inventory and you could actually go ahead and move it next to a work center bin. Okay, the work center bin allows you then to quickly backflush or consume that inventory immediately at the time of routing step for that particular production order, in the case of a production order. Okay. And then the final, right, we have the expert directed put away and pick. That is very heavy on rules and logic, and that will automate, right, your situation where you may need to maybe possibly run what's called the bin ranking or bin movement worksheet, where you need to replenish a bin, kind of a Kanban system. You need to go and replenish a bin. Once the stocking bin is replenished, then you could go and pick from a stocking bin and go ahead and put to a kind of a bin that will consume the inventory at that point. Very similar to a warehousing bin, but there's some more it's a full system-driven process, how the system is going to provide or issue picks and issue those to a production order. Okay. So just to recap that particular portion is, how does inventory get consumed out of the location and to the supply document? You have a very general location. You have a very general setup, which is like the basic warehousing setup, where you take inventory from a location and issue it directly to a supply order. The second way is an intermediary way, what I like to call it, and that's an inventory pick, where the system, you take inventory from a location or location bin, issue a pick directly from the general stocking area and directly into the supply line, okay, which in our case is a production order. The third way is a warehousing pick, which is an advanced warehousing solution that's implemented, and that takes inventory from the general stocking area, again, location or bin, and allows you to put it into a kind of temporary holding bin or location, holding bin, so that it gets consumed kind of almost real time at the point of routing, right? Processing the routing step. And then you got the more advanced, the expert level warehousing flow, which is a directed put away, which kind of looks at your full inventory channel internally and says where you need to replenish your bin, try to keep bin stocking levels very optimal. So the idea there is that you would go ahead and process that inventory movement for the bin to keep us an optimal stocking bin, and from the stocking bin it goes into a picking bin, which could be again next to the warehouse. And ultimately what this last process allows you to do is keep the inventory flow and transactions not as real time, so it doesn't hit the general ledger as quickly. So what I mean by that is you could go ahead and do inventory transactions using the expert warehousing flow, and once a month, or it could be periodically during the week, you'd run a function on the item journal to bring in those warehouse movements to post those to the general ledger, right? So that gives you a chance to maybe make corrections that anyone that's done any mistakes in the picking process, or just to go ahead and reconcile, right, the inventory that was actually picked and consumed out of stock. Okay. Now, what happens after the production is complete for this is a few different things, right? And again, the way it moves from a basic warehousing flow or through all the different warehousing flows itself is a little different. If you are implementing the warehousing process without, just a basic flow, so just out of location, then that inventory out of a production order, just output it directly to inventory. Okay, and then that could then be shipped to a customer using the quantity to ship fields on the sales order, right? Or you could even implement, you could always implement also warehouse shipments. The other way is the intermediary, where you issue where there's a inventory pick, but that does not have any bearing or effect on how production orders are output. You could go ahead and output production straight to a particular location, and when you do that via the production journal, or you do it through a shop floor control timekeeping system, or you could do that via the consumption journal, right? You decide at that point in time what location inventory is going to go to. If you have putaways turned on, okay, you could implement putaways at the output level. So meaning that there's the fields on the location card that allows you to say, okay, when I finish a production order, out of this, then it looks at the work center level, where it goes and outputs inventory, kind of like a staging bin, or before inventory is then fully put away into a stocking bin, okay, out of the supply document. Okay. Then what happens, right? Then that whole manufacturing and production flow kind of goes on for a little while, typically, right? Depending on how deep your bill of material is, right? How many sub-assemblies you're manufacturing. They go in stock, those sub-assemblies go into stock, and then they go out of stock, right? Based on the requirements of a higher level production order, right? If it's a receiving item, it goes into stock and then it gets consumed into the production order, right? So that's kind of that's a typical movement from a production standpoint or an assembly standpoint. But then once inventory is outputted from a production order, it could then go sits in stock, right? It goes into a location or a location bin, okay? And then there's a few other steps that happen that calls for that inventory, right? And that's usually to the outbound order. That's usually the demand document, which is like the sales order, right? Typically, it could be the job, any of the demand, right, lines itself in the system. So what happens there is you could have a basic warehousing flow. You issue inventory from a location directly to the document. It gets consumed. You get an item ledger entry type of shipment, and then you're done, right? Inventory is decremented out of your system. Now, using the intermediary document, intermediary warehouse flow, you implement what's called an inventory pick. So you actually call for a pick when you're looking to ship inventory. Maybe you have a back order or backlog process. So you run picks for all your sales orders. It goes out, generates an individual pick, and then tells you what inventory is available depending on the sales line field level type, which could be shipping advice, could be complete or partial. So based on that, it looks at if inventory is available for you to create a pick for this particular demand document, and then it effectively creates those picks, and those picks are sent to the material handler on the floor. They go and research, make sure there's inventory in those specific locations or bins together, and picks the inventory, brings it back to the shipping dock, and then ultimately posts that inventory pick, which then effectively takes inventory out of the system, okay, and then allows you to complete that shipment. The other flow around that is implementing warehousing picks, right? And that's kind of what I like to term, again, this advanced warehousing flow. So the warehouse pick could be created using the pick worksheet, potentially, Okay, the pick worksheet would go ahead and look at all those demand lines. And what the pick worksheet allows you to do is create consolidated picks. So it could tell you, okay, pick, for this item, you need to pick it for 5 different sales orders. So go ahead and the system will go ahead and issue a single pick for that. All right, and tell you to move inventory from the general stocking bins to a shipment bin. Okay, that ultimately then gets posted via a warehouse shipment effectively. Right, the pick worksheet is a great feature for those companies that have very high volume of picks, that needs to consolidate picks on the floor, right, and they then could then send it to a staging bin for the remaining of the process to be complete. And then you have the expert warehousing flow around that shipping process, which is the directed put away and pick, which again, like very similar to the production side, is where it implements a Kanban type system, and you could go ahead and replenish bins, the shipping bin, especially if you have high volume moving items, and the system will automatically suggest to replenish those shipping bins. So you could create a pick, post a pick, and then ship very quickly between the time this demand sales order is created and quickly get the inventory out of stock for that customer. And then ultimately what you could do is in the inventory journal, catch the inventory system up with inventory journal financially, bring in those warehouse activities or those movements, and then post those movements to the inventory journal or the item journal, so then they reflect financially of those movements. Okay. So that from just a flow level, right? The typical flow level, that's the warehousing flow. So how does all that get supported, right? Remember, I just talked about four different typically processes or warehouse flows. The first was basic, then you have intermediary, then you have advanced, and then you have expert. Okay, so here at the next slide, what options do you have available to you? You have the basic warehousing, intermediary warehousing, advanced warehousing, and you have expert warehousing. Okay, and what I'm going to do now with the group is go through each one of these and kind of talk about what flags you would turn on and what documents that would also represent that you would use in your Business Central environment. Basic warehousing, right? No picks, less rules. This is a great environment for those companies that are, let's say, a startup company. Companies that don't have the discipline immediately to record inventory real time. They're just issuing documents to the floor to say, hey, pick this, pick that, but there's really no kind of allocation. There's really no control over on-hand inventory. Again, this is a lot, good for startup companies, maybe those specific locations that, need very less inventory control itself, right? That's what this basic warehousing kind of slide is trying to represent, is how do we set up a basic warehousing location? So first is location is mandatory. And that's set up on the inventory setup card. It's called a location mandatory. So usually I always like to flag that will ensure that your inventory doesn't get lost in the black hole, what I like to say, and at least get tracked through item ledger entries via locations. And then you have bins, right? You could have bins, but bins is optional in this basic warehousing setup. You don't really need bins. I've seen customers that try to kind of get away without just bins itself. It's a little difficult. If you're doing bins, you're going to want to start, maybe do the picking, the inventory pick or the warehouse pick. But basic warehousing, that's an optional setup. Warehouse receipt, that's optional, but generally that's not turned on a basic warehousing type of setup. And the reason why that is because you have maybe a couple people in the warehouse, right? And they're just receiving inventory, and they're maybe doing item journals directly into stock if they don't have purchase orders implemented, or they're receiving directly off a purchase order directly into stock, right? They don't have the manpower to complete extra documents. And one of the things about warehousing and setting up a warehouse successfully in Business Central is you always have to look at the cost benefit of all the transactions, right? All these transactions, in essence, do have a cost. They have overhead cost. Does the cost of the transaction, or does the benefit of the transaction, I'd like to say, outweigh the cost of the transaction? What are you gaining out of this, setting up warehouse in a certain way? You're gaining efficiency, you're gaining tighter inventory control, less scrap, higher, you get less, less quantity variances when you're doing physical inventory, so on and so forth. What are you really gaining? That really has to be put in perspective when you're setting up your warehousing properly in Business Central, and evaluating that, right? Now we're going to go into the next one is warehouse shipment. Again, that's optional for basic warehousing structure. You would not want to turn this on. You're just going to want to say, okay, when we're shipping to a customer, we're going to go ahead and ship and not worry about effectively. We're not going to worry about issuing, allocating inventory to a pick or moving that to a shipping bin or whatnot. We're just going to go ahead and maybe directly on the sales order, select quantity to ship, and as long as there's a location on the sales line, ship that inventory to the customer, right? And then you could go ahead and invoice as well that same route. No require pick, so require pick doesn't have to be turned on in that case, right? And that just kind of goes without saying on a basic warehousing structure. And then require put away is optional. You don't need to turn that on, right? Usually you do not turn that on actually for a basic warehousing, right? And who does this help? A basic warehousing is those startup companies that don't have a true inventory control process, or companies that don't really need it. Possibly they're high volume, maybe, who knows? But this is where there's very less control over your inventory, right? You don't have default locations and bins assigned to items. Next one we have is called the intermediary warehousing. What I like to pin it as intermediary warehousing. This is where you're issuing the inventory pick. Okay. The inventory pick, right, is a formal, kind of think of it as a formal document that gets generated and gets issued to the floor because the pick document has recognized that there is inventory in the appropriate areas in the warehouse with the appropriate quantities for that item for you to fulfill that demand line. Okay, and what happens there is that there is no staging bin afterwards, meaning that when you're doing this pick, inventory pick, it immediately gets posted against the record, the source record. Whether that's going to be a supply production order or a demand shipping line, right? It gets posted directly to the source order, so you're not moving inventory internally to a bin, which then gets consumed via backflush possibly, to like, let's say, shipping or a production picking bin. This gets issued directly to the source document. That's an inventory pick. How does this get set up on the location card? The way this gets set up on a location card is location has to be mandatory. Again, that's on the inventory setup. Bin mandatory has to be turned on. Okay, now I'll take a moment with the bin mandatory setup. Once you've flagged bin mandatory, there's an option on the location card called bins. You could go into there and define your bins itself. Okay. So that could be like a receiving bin, a shipping bin, and then put all your stocking bins in the system. And then we have require pick. Require pick gets activated. Okay, that is a flag that has to be activated for inventory pick. Warehouse receipt is activated. Okay, and what the warehouse receipt is a unique transaction at the PO receiving level that allows you to go ahead and receive an inventory on a warehouse receipt that determines whether the quantities between the purchase orders match, right? You can receive in a lesser quantity, that's not a problem. Okay, and that also helps with a three-way match on the financial side. So you're matching the receipt with the purchase order with the AP invoice. Okay, so that means that you're increasing the highest likelihood that you are paying exactly what you received in, right? Because you have at this point now what you're implementing is a separation of duties within the process itself. Then your warehouse shipment is not selected. Okay, you're not implementing warehouse shipment. You're creating a inventory pick directly off of the sales order and shipping. And then again, like I said, the inventory pick would directly post against the source document. In our case, would be the sales order. Okay. Use put-away worksheet is optional. Okay. Use putaways is optional in this one. So putaways is where you are on after you receive an inventory, you could go ahead and implement a put-away process that will allow maybe a material handler to come to the receiving area, pick up inventory, and know exactly where to put it away. That's what the put-away concept effectively does, and that's optional in this particular flow. And directed put-away and pick is not activated in this flow. Who is this good for? Which environment is this good for? This is really good for those environments that want to minimize the picking, but they need to pick to allocate inventory, right? They don't want Peter to rob Paul. Effectively, they don't want the sales orders. They only want sales orders that are older or coming due to be picked and not orders in the future possibly, right? But so they have to have some sort of inventory control around that. So the picks will, dictate and drive that inventory picking process. The next flow is what I like to call the advanced warehousing. So you're picking, let's go through the warehouse pick. So you're implementing the warehouse pick here in this situation. Okay. The warehouse pick is a document that where you're now implementing a little bit more of a formal structure, and you want to tell the system, yeah, I'm going to pick it from my picking locations or bins, and I'm going to place the items. You're going to get take place lines on your picks. So you're going to place it in a staging bin, ready for it to be consumed via a warehouse shipment or directly on a routing line itself or warehouse, right? Work center itself. Okay, and here you may also want to leverage the pick worksheet. Okay, where you may want to consolidate your picks. Okay, back into the inventory pick process, you're picking, you're creating picks per document. Here, the warehouse pick, you could consolidate those picking by document. So how is this activated? It's activated via the location card, right? So obviously first you're going to have to make sure the inventory setup, the location is mandatory. And then on back on the location card, bins mandatory has to be turned on. Then you got require receive is mandatory, so that has to be turned on. Require shipment is mandatory, that has to be turned on. So effectively you're creating your warehouse shipment document. Require pick is mandatory, that has to be turned on. And require put away is mandatory, that has to be turned on. Okay. Use put away worksheet is optional, and no directed put away and pick in this particular stage. Okay. The last one here, in terms of setting up, that's the expert warehousing. This is fully determined. So, in essence, think of this as kind of being like fully automated type of warehousing flow that we're trying to implement, where we take we take the manual or the human intervention work out of it. The system is operating kind of in its setup fashion, using min-max setups, bin types, bin priorities, zones, right? So on and so forth, right? This is where you're kind of like you have your inventory control in a box, right? This is the most inflexible uh, uh, inventory control process because you are at this stage, the system would fully determine how inventory will flow, and it's very hard to have any flexibility in the system to manually make changes to pick quantities, what should be picked, and how and how you're going to be replenishing bins, because that's all driven by setup, right, from an end user standpoint. So this is the expert warehousing function. And this is really good for an Amazon type warehouse, Toyota production systems has implemented a similar type of process off of another ERP system where it's fully defined and driven off of calculations off the system, and there is no human intervention of changing pick quantities or anything like that. So here the bin mandatory has to be turned on. Selected put away and pick has to be turned on. On the location card, require pick is turned on, require shipment is turned on, require receipt is turned on. And here is where you could go set up zones against locations. You set up your bin types, bin priorities, right, and bin maxes, bin min maxes for your warehousing location itself. So that's a very important point here. Very inflexible part, but it utilizes Kanban functionality, bin replenishment, right, using the bin worksheet, and then allows you to have multiple kind of picks in that supply chain process in place to ensure you are getting picks just in time, effectively. Inventory just in time, ready to be picked, and you're ordering inventory that same way as well, right? You're very, very lean, and you have very little inventory discrepancy in terms of control, quantity in your system, right? Very little scrap. So inventory is always accurate in this type of environment, right? Very inflexible. Whereas the other environments that I showed, where you have the basic, you have the intermediary, which is the inventory pick, and you have the advanced, which is a warehousing pick, right? You have some flexibility there to change quantities on a pick, post those picks short if you needed to, right? So you could relaunch a new pick because there's some inventory quantity discrepancies within the warehousing floor itself, and things like that. So, I get down here to the final slide of my presentation. I hope everybody was able to see how powerful Business Central is, and the different options you have to set your warehouse up. And you could always also set up your warehouse in a phased approach as well. So you may decide that I want to set my warehouse up as a basic warehousing location initially, and then move up to a warehouse pick type of setup, right? And then you could turn flags on, turn flags off, different ways. Granted, there is some additional type of, probably rules and some work you may need to do with your partners to get to that point, to move inventory to different location setups or warehousing setups. But it is possible. You could start out very general and basic and move up to more complex and sophisticated inventory flow type of procedures. So with that being said, that takes me to the end of my presentation. Finished off here a little bit earlier than I was expecting, but I could leave it open for questions or how we want to proceed at this point.
Thank you, Nirav.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Nirav, thanks.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, hello. Okay. Yep.
Getting some feedback here. That's a lot better now. So just taking a look at the questions. There are no questions related to this that I can see. However, okay. I'm sure that Siram, Mr. Sahani, will have some questions or some contributions. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, when we are going for advanced warehousing, there is one question from one of the team member available over this call. He's asking me whether this location, once we create a location, once we configure a location, once the transaction happened, is there any possible to revert or change the type of location? Means location to normal location to warehouse location, or warehouse location to normal location?
Yes, there is. And in that case, there has to be a little consulting that needs to happen there because, when we're reverting back or we're going forward, we're introducing new logic into the system, and we're updating new relational tables into the system. So when we're going up, especially, right, we may want to create a new location and move inventory from the existing location to the new location, right, properly. So your bins and things like that get formally registered with the correct inventory quantities. When going down is the same thing. If you're going down in a warehousing setup, you're going to want to create a new location and do a lot of item reclass journals, or we could obviously, during a cutover standpoint, move inventory to that location now that has less control, right? But that usually happens where we introduce a new location. We cannot generally, and I don't recommend changing the configuration on existing locations that way. If you wanted to change a warehousing configuration, I would introduce a new location and move inventory to the new location appropriately.
Okay, if the customer requires to move on the same basis, on the same location, currently they are running under the concept of regular warehouse, and they will move to advanced warehouse. At that particular point of time, how we are going to manage?
Yeah, I would say create a new location on that, and then or what I've seen often, sometimes that happen, you would go ahead and run a export of all the inventory out of that current location, okay? And meaning you'd get your item on-hand inventory locations, bins, right? Whatever that is, right? If it's basic, just inventory pick is not, and now they want to move to a warehousing pick or anything like that. Export the inventory out, basically meaning that do an item journal of all that inventory to 0 in that location. If they want to really keep that location, once inventory is down to 0 in that location, then you could go and update the location flags itself. So then you could log in warehouse shipments, right, or turn on advanced put away and pick. Once you do that, complete the setups, and then import the inventory back into that same location.
Okay. Thank you so much for your great session, and I'm looking ahead for any questions. Please update on the chat so we can go ahead with the questionnaire.
Yeah.
I hope this is very good session and introduction to the warehousing as well as inventory managing using locations with different type of locations. What is the type of location? How we can manage warehousing and advanced warehousing. Overview of complete inventory management and location management in this session.
Yes. It looks like I gave back